Thomas Harrison stepped out onto his back porch, coffee mug in hand, and took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The sunlight filtered through the canopy of oak trees surrounding his new property, creating a dappled pattern on the lawn that he had come to cherish in the 3 months since moving in. After serving 15 years on the federal bench, Judge Harrison had finally found his perfect retreat. The two-story colonial home in Oak Ridge Estates wasn't the largest or most expensive in the neighborhood, but it offered something priceless: 12 mature oak trees that formed a natural privacy screen around his yard. "Morning, Your Honor," called his neighbor, Bill Chen, from over the fence. "Getting some gardening in today." Thomas smiled and nodded. Few of his neighbors knew about his profession. He preferred it that way. After weekdays spent making difficult decisions that affected people's lives, his weekends were sacred. Here, he wasn't Judge Harrison of the Federal District Court. He was just Thomas, the new guy who spent his Saturdays tending to his vegetable garden and reading books under the shade of 100-year-old trees. Planning to finish planting those tomatoes, Thomas replied, "Want to stop by later? I made too much sourdough yesterday." This simple routine had become his therapy. The pressure of high-profile cases often followed him home, but out here among the trees, Thomas found peace. He could still remember the day he first toured the property. The real estate agent had barely started her rehearsed speech when Thomas spotted the ancient oak trees and immediately said, "This is the one." That evening, as the sun began to set, Thomas walked the perimeter of his property. He ran his hand along the rough bark of the largest oak, the giant that the arborist he'd hired estimated to be over 150 years old. These trees had stood through wars, economic depressions, and countless human dramas. Their persistence reminded him of the enduring nature of justice, slow but steady. The following Monday, Thomas returned to court refreshed. His clerk noticed the difference immediately. "You seem chipper today, Judge," she remarked as she handed him the day's docket. "It's amazing what a weekend among trees can do for your outlook," he replied with a smile. Over the next several weekends, Thomas settled into his new life at Oak Ridge Estates. He joined the community garden club, attended a neighborhood barbecue, and politely declined an invitation to the HOA's monthly meeting. He reviewed the community bylaws thoroughly before purchasing, a habit from his legal background, and knew that his beloved trees were protected as heritage plants in the original development plan. What Thomas didn't know was that Melinda Chambers had been watching his property with growing disapproval. As the newly elected HOA president, she had her own vision for Oak Ridge Estates, one that prioritized uniformity over natural beauty. From her kitchen window, she could see 3 of Thomas's largest oaks, and she found their wild, untamed appearance to be at odds with her preference for manicured landscapes. "Those trees are definitely too tall," she muttered to herself, making a note in her HOA violation logbook. "We'll need to address that at the next meeting." As Thomas planted his tomato seedlings that Saturday, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in the HOA office, he felt grateful for his sanctuary. Little did he know that his peaceful retreat, and the trees he loved, would soon become the center of a neighborhood battle that would call upon all of his legal expertise and patience. Melinda Chambers stood in front of her bathroom mirror, carefully applying her signature red lipstick. At 54, she maintained the same strict routine she had followed during her 20 years as a corporate executive. Even though she was now retired, her days were filled with what she considered equally important work: maintaining the standards of Oak Ridge Estates. "Perfect," she said to her reflection, smoothing her blonde bob. Today was the monthly HOA meeting, and she had a full agenda. 3 months ago, Melinda had won the HOA presidency by a narrow margin of 7 votes. Her campaign promised property value protection and community standards enforcement. What this really meant, as neighbors quickly discovered, was Melinda's personal vision imposed on everyone else. "Harold," she called to her husband, "I'm heading to the community center early to set up. Don't forget to measure the Wilson's fence height today. I'm sure it's 3 inches above regulation." Harold nodded without looking up from his newspaper. After 30 years of marriage, he had learned that peace came from quiet agreement. The Oak Ridge Estates Community Center was Melinda's favorite place. The wall behind the main table displayed framed photographs of past HOA presidents, and she often glanced at her own portrait with pride. Today, she arranged the chairs in perfect rows and placed her color-coded violation folders on the table. "Good morning, Melinda," said Susan Parker, the HOA secretary, entering with a tray of cookies. "I brought snacks for the meeting. Melinda frowned. Store-bought. The bylaws clearly state homemade refreshments are preferred for community gatherings. Susan's smile faltered. I had a doctor's appointment yesterday and didn't have time. It's fine this time, Melinda interrupted, making a note in her small black book. But please plan better for next month. As other board members arrived, Melinda reviewed her special agenda item. She pulled out a folder labeled Harrison Property, Tree Violations, containing several photographs she had taken of Thomas Harrison's oak trees. What irritated Melinda most about the new resident wasn't just his trees. It was his quiet confidence. At the neighborhood welcome party, Harrison had politely declined her invitation to join the landscaping committee. Even worse, he hadn't seemed impressed when she mentioned her HOA presidency. He thinks he's above our rules, she muttered, organizing her photos. The meeting began promptly at 10 a.m. with 12 residents in attendance. Melinda moved efficiently through routine matters before reaching her main concern. Now, regarding the Harrison property, she said, standing to distribute her photos. As you can see, these trees are clearly overgrown and pose potential safety hazards. Board member David Johnson raised his hand. I'm not sure I see the violation, Melinda. Those oaks are beautiful and healthy. Melinda's smile tightened. Section 8, Paragraph 4 of our bylaws states that no vegetation should exceed 30 feet in height without special permission. These trees are easily 40 feet tall. What Melinda didn't mention was that she had personally added this amendment last year, and it applied to new plantings, not existing trees. She also omitted that the original development plan specifically protected heritage trees as neighborhood assets. I've drafted a violation notice, she continued, passing out copies of a letter. I'm proposing we give the homeowner 30 days to address the situation before imposing daily fines. Has anyone actually spoken to Mr. Harrison about this? Asked Maria Gonzalez, the newest board member. That's not procedure, Melinda replied dismissively. Written notices protect the association legally. After some discussion, the board narrowly approved sending the notice, with Melinda breaking the 3-3 tie vote. As the meeting ended, Melinda felt a rush of satisfaction. She had never liked those trees blocking her view of the neighborhood, and soon they would be properly trimmed or removed. Little did she know that the simple violation notice she dropped in the mail that afternoon would set in motion a battle with someone who understood rules and laws far better than she ever could. Judge Thomas Harrison returned home from court on Tuesday evening, his mind still working through the complex patent case he'd been presiding over all day. He collected his mail without much thought, tossing the stack onto his kitchen counter while he prepared a simple dinner. It wasn't until later, as he sipped a glass of red wine, that he sorted through the envelopes. Bills, a magazine subscription, and a certified letter marked RGNT, HOA violation notice from the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. Thomas raised an eyebrow as he carefully opened it. The letter, printed on official HOA letterhead with Melinda Chambers' name prominently displayed, stated in bold red letters that his property was in direct violation of Section 8, Paragraph 4 of the Community Bylaws. The offense: excessive tree height exceeding community standards. Thomas read the notice twice, his judicial instincts immediately kicking in. The letter demanded that all trees exceeding 30 feet be trimmed to regulation height or removed within 30 days, or he would face daily fines of $100. He placed the letter down and walked to his back door, looking out at the majestic oaks that had been a primary reason for purchasing the home. The evening sunlight filtered through their leaves, creating the peaceful sanctuary he treasured. This can't be right, he muttered to himself. Thomas went to his home office and pulled out the thick binder of HOA documents he had thoroughly reviewed before buying the property. He had spent 30 years in law, after all, and never signed anything without understanding every detail. After an hour of careful reading, Thomas confirmed what he already suspected. The original development plans explicitly protected heritage trees as community natural resources. Furthermore, the height restriction Melinda cited applied only to new plantings, not existing trees that predated the neighborhood's development. The next morning, Thomas called his chambers to say he'd be an hour late. He drove to the county record's office and requested the original Oak Ridge Estates development plans and all approved amendments. The clerk, recognizing him from his years on the bench, expedited the request. Interesting reading, Judge Harrison? She asked as she handed him the documents. Just some homework for a neighborhood matter, he replied with a smile. As he suspected, the records confirmed his understanding. The heritage tree protection was clearly documented, with specific mention of the oak grove that now stood on his property. That evening, Thomas composed a careful response to Melinda's notice. He cited the relevant sections of the original community plan, included copies of the county records, and politely but firmly explained that her interpretation of the bylaws was incorrect. He maintained a respectful tone throughout, never mentioning his profession or expertise. I look forward to resolving this misunderstanding amicably, he concluded before signing simply as Thomas Harrison, homeowner. 3 days later, Thomas was working in his garden when a silver Mercedes SUV pulled into his driveway. Melinda Chambers emerged wearing a crisp white pantsuit and oversized sunglasses. "Mr. Harrison," she called out, her heels clicking on the concrete as she approached. "I received your response to our violation notice." Thomas stood, brushing soil from his hands. "Good afternoon, Miss Chambers. I was hoping we could discuss this matter reasonably." Melinda's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I appreciate your research, but you're misinterpreting the bylaws. The board has unanimously determined that your trees pose a safety hazard and diminish neighborhood aesthetics." Thomas noticed she was recording their conversation on her phone. Interesting, he thought, maintaining his calm demeanor. "Actually, the protection of heritage trees is quite explicit in the founding documents," he explained. "I'd be happy to walk through the relevant sections with the entire board." Melinda's smile tightened. "Mr. Harrison, I don't think you understand how things work here. The HOA board makes the final determination on all property matters." "I understand completely how things should work," Thomas replied evenly, "according to proper procedure and documented regulations." As Melinda turned to leave, she delivered what she clearly thought was her final word. "You have 27 days to comply before fines begin. I suggest you contact a good tree service." Thomas watched her drive away, shaking his head slightly. In 15 years on the federal bench, he had faced down corporate lawyers, criminal defendants, and government agencies. An overzealous HOA president didn't particularly worry him. What he didn't realize was just how far Melinda Chambers was willing to go to win this battle. Melinda Chambers paced back and forth in her living room, the letter from Thomas Harrison gripped tightly in her hand. Her husband Harold watched nervously from his recliner as her face grew increasingly flushed. "Who does he think he is?" she fumed, slapping the letter against her palm. "Quoting bylaws to me? I practically wrote those bylaws." "Maybe he has a point about the heritage trees," Harold suggested cautiously. "I remember when we moved in, the developer did mention those oaks were protected." Melinda shot him a glare that immediately silenced him. "That's not the point, Harold. This is about respect for authority. First, Harrison ignores my tree regulations. Next thing, everyone will think they can break whatever rules they want." She stopped pacing suddenly, a new thought crossing her mind. "Wait a minute. Isn't he that new homeowner who never attends our meetings? Always too busy with work commitments." Melinda marched to her home office and pulled out her HOA files. She flipped through Harrison's application documents, searching for details she might have overlooked. His employment section simply listed federal government, legal department. Nothing specific, nothing she could use. "I need to make some calls," she muttered. Over the next 2 days, Melinda contacted several board members individually, carefully sharing select parts of Harrison's response while emphasizing the potential precedent this could set for other homeowners. By Friday, she had secured enough preliminary support for her plan. Meanwhile, Thomas Harrison was packing for a 3-week trip to Washington, D.C. A complex international trade case required his presence, and he would be staying at his small apartment near the federal courthouse. As he loaded his suitcase into his car, his neighbor Bill Chen waved from across the street. "Heading out of town, Tom?" Bill called. "Yes, work assignment for about 3 weeks," Thomas replied. "Would you mind keeping an eye on the place?" "No problem. I'll grab your mail and make sure everything looks good." Thomas handed Bill a spare key. "I appreciate it. Hopefully that tree situation with the HOA will blow over while I'm gone." Bill frowned. "Melinda's on a tear about those trees. Be careful. She got the Wilsons to remove their garden fountain last year while they were on vacation. Said it was 2 inches taller than regulations allowed." Thomas thanked Bill for the warning, but wasn't particularly concerned. He had followed proper procedures and documented everything. The law was clearly on his side in this matter. 2 days after Thomas left town, Melinda called an emergency HOA board meeting. The official notice cited urgent safety concerns requiring immediate attention, which most board members assumed involved the recent thunderstorm damage to the community pool. When only 5 of the 9 board members arrived at Melinda's house for the hastily arranged evening meeting, she proceeded anyway, ignoring the bylaw requiring a minimum of 7 members for emergency actions. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Melinda began, passing out folders. "I've received concerning information from a certified arborist about the Harrison property." The folders contained photos of large trees that appeared to be leaning dangerously, with close-ups of what looked like diseased sections. What she didn't mention was that these photos were actually from a different neighborhood entirely, taken after a severe storm the previous year. "As you can see," Melinda continued gravely, "these trees present an imminent danger to surrounding properties. With the hurricane season approaching, we simply cannot wait for Mr. Harrison to decide whether he'll comply with our notices." David Johnson frowned at the photos. "These don't look like the same oaks I saw last month. They appeared perfectly healthy then." "Disease can progress rapidly," Melinda replied smoothly. "And more importantly, our bylaws give us authority to address safety hazards immediately." After an hour of carefully orchestrated discussion, Melinda called for a vote. With 3 members in favor, 1 opposed, and 1 abstaining, she declared the motion passed to remove all trees on the Harrison property that exceeded regulation height. "I'll handle the contractor arrangements myself," she assured them. "We need to act quickly while the weather permits." As the meeting adjourned, Melinda couldn't help but smile. Thomas Harrison would return to find his precious trees gone, and there was nothing he could do about it. By then, it would be too late. Thomas Harrison's flight landed at 7:30 p.m. after 3 exhausting weeks in Washington. The trade case had been particularly challenging, requiring long hours and intense concentration. All he wanted now was to get home, make a simple dinner, and sit on his back porch watching the sunset through his beloved oak trees. As his taxi turned onto his street, Thomas noticed something odd about the skyline. Something was missing. The familiar silhouette of his property seemed strangely bare against the evening sky. "You can stop here," he told the driver, suddenly anxious to get out. Standing on the sidewalk, luggage in hand, Thomas stared in disbelief at his property. Every single oak tree was gone. Where majestic trees had stood for over a century, there were now only fresh stumps, some nearly 3 feet in diameter. Sawdust covered his lawn like strange yellow snow. The privacy, the shade, the natural beauty that had drawn him to this home, all vanished. Thomas walked slowly up his driveway, a hollow feeling spreading through his chest. The house looked naked and exposed without the protective canopy of branches. Birds that had nested in those trees now circled overhead, seemingly as confused as he was by the sudden change in landscape. Bill Chen ran across the street, his face filled with guilt and anger. "Tom, I'm so sorry. I tried to stop them, but they had papers claiming HOA authorization." "When did this happen?" Thomas asked quietly, his judicial composure hiding the storm brewing inside. 3 days ago, a crew showed up with heavy equipment. 6 guys with chainsaws and a wood chipper. They worked from sunrise to sunset. Bill shook his head. That Melinda woman supervised the whole thing, standing there with a clipboard, checking off each tree as it came down. Thomas nodded, taking in this information while surveying the devastation. "Did anyone else from the HOA board come by?" "No, just her. When I questioned the authorization, she said it was an emergency safety measure approved by the full board. I called David Johnson. He's on the board. By then they'd already cut down half the trees." Thomas walked to the largest stump near what had been his favorite reading spot. He placed his hand on the exposed rings of the wood, feeling the rough texture of a life cut short. Each ring represented a year of growth, decades, even centuries of history now reduced to a circular platform on his lawn. "Did they leave any documentation?" Thomas asked, his voice still unnaturally calm. Bill handed him a wrinkled notice that had been taped to his front door. "Just this. I kept it for you." The notice, printed on official HOA letterhead, cited emergency safety action under Bylaw Section 12 and claimed a unanimous board vote had authorized immediate removal of hazardous trees on his property. It was signed by Melinda Chambers alone, with no other board member signatures as required for emergency actions. Thomas folded the paper carefully and put it in his pocket. "Thank you, Bill. I appreciate you trying to intervene." After Bill left, Thomas walked the perimeter of his property, counting stumps. 12 trees in total, all cut as close to the ground as possible. The landscape company had even taken away most of the larger pieces of wood. Nothing remained of the trees except their lowest parts embedded in the earth. Inside his house, Thomas found a bill slipped under his door. The tree removal service had been performed by Chambers Landscaping Solutions, with a company address matching Melinda's home. The bill charged the HOA account $8,400 for emergency hazard removal. Thomas sat at his kitchen table, the bill and notice laid out before him. For the first time in years, direct sunlight streamed through his kitchen window without the filtering effect of leaves. The house felt warmer, exposed, and strangely empty. He picked up his phone and called his clerk at the courthouse. "Janet, I need a favor. Please clear my calendar for tomorrow. I have a personal matter that requires immediate attention." As he hung up, Thomas looked out at the stumps dotting his property. In 15 years on the bench, he had maintained his judicial temperament through complex, emotional cases. He had always separated his personal feelings from his professional judgment. But now, facing this deliberate destruction of something he cherished, Thomas felt a cold, precise anger taking shape, the kind that demanded not vengeance, but justice. Melinda Chambers had no idea what she had just started, or who she was up against. Thomas Harrison sat at his dining room table surrounded by stacks of documents. It was 7:30 a.m., but he had been awake since 4, methodically building his case. He worked with the same focused precision that had earned him respect in federal courtrooms across the country. "Start with the facts," he murmured to himself, organizing his notes into categories. First, he reviewed the HOA bylaws and the original community covenant. He highlighted the Heritage Tree Protection Clause and the procedures required for emergency actions. Next, he examined the notice Melinda had left, noting the procedural violations. Most damning was the connection between Melinda and the tree removal company, a clear conflict of interest that she had never disclosed. His doorbell rang at exactly 8 a.m. Thomas opened the door to find Maria Gonzalez, the newest HOA board member, nervously shifting her weight from foot to foot. "Judge Harrison, I heard about what happened to your trees. I needed to talk to you," she said, glancing around as if worried about being seen. Thomas invited her in, offering coffee, which she gratefully accepted. "I didn't know you were a judge," Maria began, clutching her mug. "None of us did. Melinda just referred to you as the difficult new homeowner." Thomas nodded. "My profession isn't relevant to how I should be treated as a homeowner. Please, tell me what happened with this emergency vote." Maria explained that only 5 board members had been present for Melinda's hastily called meeting, below the 7 required for quorum. The photos Melinda had shown weren't even from his property, but from storm damage in another neighborhood. Most importantly, the vote had been 3-2, not unanimous as Melinda had claimed. "I voted against it," Maria said firmly. "David did too. This document is a lie." She handed Thomas a copy of the meeting minutes that Melinda had later distributed, showing a falsified unanimous vote. Thomas thanked her for her honesty, carefully adding her statement to his growing file. By noon, he had spoken with 3 other board members who confirmed they either hadn't attended the emergency meeting or had been misled about the condition of the trees. He visited the county assessor's office and obtained official documentation of the property's heritage trees, valued conservatively at $15,000 each for the largest specimens. That afternoon, Thomas drove to the offices of Eleanor Park, a former colleague who now specialized in property law. "Tom, this is outrageous," Eleanor said after reviewing his materials. "You have a solid case for property damage, fraudulent misrepresentation, procedural violations, and likely personal liability for Ms. Chambers given her connection to the removal company." Thomas nodded. "I want to proceed carefully. This isn't about revenge. It's about accountability and ensuring this doesn't happen to other homeowners." "Are you filing as Judge Harrison?" Eleanor asked. "That would certainly get their attention." Thomas considered this for a moment. "No, I'll file as Thomas Harrison, homeowner. My profession shouldn't matter in this case. The facts speak for themselves. Together, they drafted a civil complaint seeking treble damages for the destroyed trees, totaling over $450,000, an injunction against further HOA actions without proper procedure, and removal of Melinda Chambers from the board for ethics violations. When Bill Chen stopped by that evening to check on his neighbor, he found Thomas calmly watering the flower beds around the stumps of his once magnificent oaks. "You seem surprisingly composed," Bill observed. Thomas smiled slightly. "There's a difference between anger and resolve, Bill. Melinda Chambers operated as if she was above the rules, as if her position gave her unlimited authority. That's not how our system works, not in neighborhoods and not in courts." "So what happens next?" Bill asked. "Due process," Thomas replied, turning off the hose. "Something Ms. Chambers should have considered before cutting down 100-year-old trees." As the sun set on his now exposed property, Thomas sealed the final documents in an envelope. Tomorrow, Melinda Chambers would learn what happens when self-appointed authority meets legitimate legal procedure. Not through intimidation or power plays, but through the patient, methodical application of the very rules she claimed to uphold. Melinda Chambers entered the county courthouse with confident strides, her leather portfolio tucked under her arm. She wore her most impressive outfit, a navy blue suit with gold buttons that she reserved for important occasions. Behind her trailed her husband Harold and Roger Simmons, the HOA's attorney. "Remember?" Roger whispered as they approached the courtroom. "This Harrison guy is just trying to intimidate the association. The Emergency Powers Clause gives the HOA broad authority. We've handled cases like this before." Melinda nodded, her perfectly styled blonde bob bouncing slightly. "He's just upset about losing those eyesore trees. Once the judge understands the safety concerns, this will all go away." They pushed through the heavy wooden doors into courtroom 3. Melinda scanned the room, quickly spotting Thomas Harrison sitting quietly at the plaintiff's table. He wore a simple gray suit and appeared to be reviewing documents. No flashy lawyer beside him, just a middle-aged woman Melinda didn't recognize. "Is he representing himself?" Melinda whispered to Roger, a smirk forming on her lips. "This will be even easier than we thought." They settled into their seats at the defense table. Roger arranged his documents while Melinda kept glancing at Thomas, wondering why he seemed so calm for someone about to be humiliated in court. At exactly 9:00 a.m., the bailiff entered from a side door. "All rise. The County Court of Willow Creek is now in session. The Honorable Judge Rebecca Torres presiding." A stern-looking woman in her 60s entered in flowing black robes. Melinda straightened her posture, ready to make a good impression on the judge who would surely see things from her perspective. Judge Torres settled behind the bench and adjusted her glasses. "Good morning. We're here for case number CV 2025-873, Harrison versus Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association and Melinda Chambers. Are all parties present?" Both sides confirmed they were ready to proceed. "Very well," Judge Torres continued, reviewing her notes. "This is an interesting case involving the removal of heritage trees without proper authorization. Let's begin with opening statements, Mr. Harrison." Thomas rose slowly and buttoned his jacket. "Thank you, Your Honor. Before I begin my opening statement, I should disclose something to the court in the interest of transparency." Judge Torres nodded. "Please proceed." "While I'm appearing today as a private citizen in a civil matter, I should note that Judge Torres and I have previously worked together in a professional capacity." Melinda frowned, looking between Thomas and the judge with confusion. Judge Torres removed her glasses. "Yes, indeed. Good morning, Judge Harrison. It's certainly unusual to see you on that side of the courtroom." The color drained from Melinda's face. She grabbed Roger's arm. "Did she just call him Judge Harrison?" she hissed. Roger looked equally stunned. "I don't understand. His paperwork just listed him as a government employee in legal services." Judge Torres continued. "For the record, Judge Thomas Harrison serves on the Federal District Court and has for 15 years. While this has no bearing on the merits of today's case, it's appropriate to disclose our professional relationship. Does the defense have any objection to my presiding over this matter?" Roger stood shakily. No objection, Your Honor. This is unexpected, but we have no issue with you presiding." Melinda couldn't tear her eyes away from Thomas, who stood calmly at his table. The quiet, unassuming neighbor she had dismissed as ignorant of rules and procedures was actually a federal judge, someone who had spent his entire career interpreting and applying the law. Judge Torres nodded. Very well. Judge Harrison, you may proceed with your opening statement. Thomas approached the podium with the measured steps of someone who had done this countless times before. He carried no notes. Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about the abuse of power and disregard for established rules. He began in a clear, authoritative voice that filled the courtroom. The evidence will show that Ms. Chambers acted without proper authority, falsified HOA documents, violated clear bylaws protecting heritage trees, and used her position for personal financial gain through her family's tree removal business. Melinda sank lower in her chair as Thomas methodically outlined each violation. The confident smirk she had worn when entering the courtroom had vanished completely. In its place was the dawning realization that her shortcuts, manipulations, and disregard for proper procedure were about to be examined by two judges who had spent their careers upholding the rule of law. As Thomas concluded his opening statement, Melinda leaned over to Roger and whispered with genuine fear in her voice, "Why didn't anyone tell me he was a federal judge?" The final day of the trial arrived with a packed courtroom. Word had spread through Oak Ridge Estates about the showdown between HOA President Melinda Chambers and federal Judge Thomas Harrison. Residents filled the benches, eager to witness the conclusion. Judge Torres entered promptly at 9 a.m., the room falling silent as she took her seat. This court is ready to deliver its ruling in Harrison versus Oak Ridge Estates HOA and Melinda Chambers. Thomas sat calmly at the plaintiff's table, his posture relaxed but attentive. Across the aisle, Melinda looked noticeably different from the confident woman who had first entered the courtroom. Her complexion was pale, her normally perfect hair slightly disheveled. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, Judge Torres began, "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff on all counts." A murmur rippled through the spectators. Judge Torres continued, her voice clear and measured. "The facts in this case are unambiguous. Ms. Chambers conducted an emergency meeting without proper notice or quorum, presented misleading evidence about the condition of heritage trees, falsified board voting records, and authorized tree removal through a company owned by her brother-in-law, a clear conflict of interest she never disclosed to the HOA board." Melinda stared at the table, unable to meet the judge's gaze. Furthermore, the original covenant of Oak Ridge Estates explicitly protected the heritage oak trees on Mr. Harrison's property as community natural assets. Ms. Chambers was aware of this protection but deliberately ignored it. Judge Torres adjusted her glasses before delivering the final judgment. The court orders the following. First, Ms. Chambers is personally liable for the value of the destroyed trees, assessed at $180,000. Due to the willful and malicious nature of her actions, treble damages are awarded, bringing the total to $540,000. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Harold Chambers gripped the edge of the table, his face ashen. Second, Ms. Chambers is removed from the HOA board effective immediately and barred from serving on any community board for a period of 5 years. Third, the Oak Ridge Estates HOA bylaws must be amended within 30 days to require transparent voting procedures, proper documentation of all actions, and enhanced protection for remaining natural features. Judge Torres paused, looking directly at Melinda. This case serves as a powerful reminder that rules and procedures exist for everyone, not just for those without power or connections. When we ignore proper process for convenience or personal benefit, we undermine the very community standards we claim to protect. She gavelled the session closed. As the courtroom cleared, Thomas remained seated, absorbing the outcome with quiet satisfaction. It wasn't about the money. No amount could replace his century-old trees. It was about accountability. 3 months later, Thomas hosted a community gathering in his backyard. Where massive oaks had once stood, a dozen young saplings now reached toward the sky, the first plantings from the Oak Ridge Estates Tree Preservation Fund, established with his settlement money. It'll be 50 years before they provide real shade, Thomas explained to his neighbors as he watered the saplings. I won't be here to see it, but someone will. The new HOA president, Maria Gonzalez, approached with a framed document. The board unanimously approved the updated bylaws. We've named the new transparency rules the Harrison provisions. Thomas smiled, accepting the frame. Rules only work when everyone follows them, especially those in positions of authority. Across the neighborhood, moving trucks stood in front of Melinda's house. The financial judgment had forced the Chambers to sell their home and downsize considerably. As workers carried boxes to the truck, Melinda caught sight of Thomas's gathering from her window. She watched briefly before closing the blinds for the final time. That evening, as sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Thomas sat on his porch looking at his property. Without the mature tree canopy, he could now see the entire neighborhood, the connected homes, shared spaces, and community that extended beyond property lines. He smiled at the irony. In losing his trees, he had gained something equally valuable, a neighborhood that now understood the importance of fairness, transparency, and respecting both the letter and spirit of the rules they lived by. Justice, like his young oak saplings, had taken root in Oak Ridge Estates.